Have you ever noticed something so peculiar that you couldn't explain it? That moment when you think of someone, and seconds later, they call. Or when a specific symbol appears repeatedly in your life during critical moments. These aren't coincidences. The universe speaks, constantly, in whispers and shouts, through patterns, people, and seemingly random events. When was the last time you felt that strange tug, that inexplicable feeling that something was trying to reach you? That sensation isn't imagination, it's recognition. Most people walk through life, missing these messages entirely. They're too busy, too distracted, too focused on the surface of existence to notice the depths calling to them. But you've sensed it. You've felt that there's something more. The universe communicates through what Carl Jung, one of history's most profound psychological pioneers, called synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that defy conventional explanation. These aren't random occurrences. They're signposts, messages, personal communications from the vast unconscious to your conscious mind. But why don't we see them? Why do these messages often pass unnoticed? Because we've been conditioned not to look. We've been taught to dismiss the mysterious, to rationalize the inexplicable, to ignore the whispers of our own souls. We've learned to value only what can be measured, quantified, and logically explained. The truth is, your rational mind is merely the gatekeeper to a far more expansive reality, one that Jung called the collective unconscious. This vast reservoir of human experience contains everything, all symbols, all archetypes, all patterns that have ever existed in human consciousness. Ask yourself, what patterns keep appearing in your life? What situations, relationships, or challenges repeat themselves, wearing different faces but carrying the same essence? The universe isn't punishing you, it's trying to show you something. You see, Jung believed that the psyche is constantly seeking wholeness, what he termed individuation. It's the process of becoming who you truly are, of integrating all fragmented aspects of yourself into a complete, authentic being. And the universe, it's your ally in this process, ceaselessly sending you the exact messages you need for your evolution. But there's a barrier, a formidable one. Jung called it the shadow, those denied, repressed, and rejected aspects of yourself that you've pushed into the darkness of your unconscious mind. The parts of you that you've deemed unacceptable, unlovable, or simply too frightening to acknowledge. Your shadow doesn't disappear when ignored. It grows stronger in the dark. It speaks louder, acts out, and most significantly, it projects itself onto the world around you. What if I told you that the person who irritates you most in the world is actually carrying a projected piece of your unacknowledged self? That the traits you find most unbearable in others are precisely the traits you've refused to see in yourself? This isn't about blame, it's about awareness. Your unconscious mind is like an underground river flowing beneath the surface of your conscious thoughts, influencing every decision, every reaction, every emotion. It doesn't communicate in words. It speaks through symbols, emotions, physical sensations, dreams, and those strange coincidences that make you and wonder. The moment you feel inexplicably drawn to or repelled by something, that's a message. The sudden emotion that seems disproportionate to the situation, that's a message. The dream that stays with you all day, that's a message. Are you listening? Jung understood that the human mind naturally creates symbols to represent complex psychological realities that cannot be expressed directly. These symbols emerge from what he called archetypes, universal patterns and images that derive from the collective unconscious. Think of archetypes as the fundamental characters in the story of human existence: the hero, the mother, the wise old man, the trickster, the shadow. These aren't just literary devices, They're psychological forces active within your psyche right now, influencing how you perceive and interact with the world. When an archetype is activated in your life, the universe sends messages related to its energy. You might suddenly encounter the same archetypal figure across different contexts, in a book you're reading, a stranger you meet, a dream you have. These aren't coincidences, they're communications. But from what, you might ask? From whom? Yourself, your complete self. The self that exists beyond the narrow confines of your conscious identity. Jung called this the self with a capital S, the totality of your psyche, both conscious and unconscious. The self orchestrates your psychological growth. It knows what you need to encounter, what you need to remember, what you need to integrate, and it arranges these encounters through what appears to be chance, but is actually profound psychological design. Consider the mirrors surrounding you. Every person who evokes a strong emotional reaction is reflecting something about you, something you either embrace or deny. This isn't mysticism, it's psychology. Jung called it projection. Projection occurs when unconscious content is perceived in an external object or person. You attribute to others the very qualities, desires, or emotions that you've denied in yourself. The judgmental person, who accuses everyone of harboring secret judgments, they're projecting their own judgmental nature. The suspicious partner who sees potential infidelity everywhere, they're projecting their own unacknowledged desires or insecurities. The universe arranges these projections as messages, bringing you face to face with the exact aspects of yourself that you need to recognize and integrate. This isn't comfortable. Truth rarely is. But what if your pain isn't punishment? What if it's guidance? What if those recurring patterns of suffering are actually breadcrumbs leading you back to yourself? The universe speaks most loudly through pain because pain commands attention. When you're suffering, you can't ignore the message anymore. You're forced to listen, to look deeper, to question. Think about your life's greatest challenges. The relationships that broke you open, the failures that humbled you, the losses that emptied you out. Weren't these also your greatest teachers? Didn't they show you aspects of yourself that nothing else could have revealed? Jung believed that neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. When you refuse to consciously engage with necessary pain, the pain of growth, of letting go, of facing truth, that pain doesn't disappear. It transforms into psychological symptoms, anxiety, depression, compulsions, addictions. These aren't just disorders, they're messages in another form. The symptom says, look here, attend to this, something needs integration. Your psychological symptoms are not your enemies. They're messengers from your unconscious, trying desperately to bring attention to neglected aspects of your psyche. This internal weather, these emotional storms that seem to arise from nowhere, they're communications from the depths of your being. Your sudden anger, your unexplained sadness, your inexplicable fear. These aren't random, they're responses to unconscious content being activated. The language of emotion is precise, even when you don't understand what it's saying. Anger says something is threatening your boundaries. Fear says something is threatening your safety. Sadness says something valuable has been lost. Joy says something essential has been found. These emotions aren't just reactions to external events. They're messages about your internal reality. But we've been taught to dismiss our emotions, to control them, to rise above them. We've learned to privilege rational thought over emotional wisdom. And in doing so, we've cut ourselves off from one of the universe's primary methods of communication. What if your emotions are actually the of your unconscious mind, trying to tell you what you need to know? Jung understood that emotions carry energy, psychic energy. When that energy isn't acknowledged and integrated consciously, it doesn't disappear. It remains in the unconscious, building pressure, seeking expression. And eventually it will find a way out, through dreams, slips of the tongue, accidental behaviors, physical symptoms, or projections onto others. The psyche always seeks balance. Always. This is why the universe seems to place us repeatedly in situations that trigger the same emotional reactions. It's not punishment, it's not bad luck. It's the psyche creating opportunities for integration, chances to bring unconscious content into consciousness, where it can be processed and incorporated into a more complete self-understanding. The battleground of your internal conflicts, those situations where you feel torn between what you think and what you feel, between what you want and what you fear, this is sacred territory. This is where the message is trying to emerge. This is where growth happens. When you find yourself caught in the same internal struggle again and again, ask yourself, what am I not seeing? What am I not accepting? What part of myself am I at war with? Because the war isn't with the external world, it's with yourself. Jung believed that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. Those people who trigger you most intensely, they're not your enemies, they're your teachers. They're showing you the parts of yourself that you've cast into shadow. The person whose selfishness infuriates you might be reflecting your own denied needs or unacknowledged self-interest. The lazy colleague who drives you to distraction might be mirroring your own repressed desire for rest or your fear of inadequacy. This doesn't mean you're responsible for others' behavior. It means you're responsible for your reaction to their behavior, and that reaction contains valuable information about your unconscious mind. The unconscious speaks in paradoxes. It presents contradictions that the rational mind struggles to reconcile. You can be both strong and vulnerable. You can both desire connection and fear it. You can both love someone and feel anger toward them. These paradoxes aren't problems to solve. They're tensions to hold, creative tensions that generate energy for growth. Jung understood that the integration of opposites is essential for psychological health. The masculine and feminine within each person, the light and shadow, the conscious and unconscious. These aren't enemies to be reconciled. They're partners in a dance of becoming. The universe orchestrates this dance, bringing you exactly what you need to encounter for the next step in your psychological development. Sometimes it's a challenge that forces you to develop a neglected skill. Sometimes it's a relationship that triggers old wounds so they can finally heal. Sometimes it's a loss that creates space for something new. These aren't random events. They're communications, invitations. But here's the painful truth. Most people miss these invitations entirely. They remain caught in unconscious patterns, repeating the same mistakes, experiencing the same suffering, wondering why nothing changes. The difference between a life of unconscious reaction and conscious response is awareness. Simple, but not easy. Awareness begins with the willingness to look at what's actually happening, rather than what you think should be happening. It requires the courage to question your own narratives, to examine your automatic reactions, to consider that what seems objectively true might actually be a subjective interpretation filtered through your unconscious biases and projections. This isn't about self-blame, it's about self-revelation. The messages from the universe aren't judgments. They're opportunities to see yourself more clearly, to expand your consciousness, to integrate more of your authentic being into your lived experience. Jung believed that your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakes. The awakening isn't always gentle. Often it's jarring, a disruption of comfortable patterns, a challenge to cherished assumptions. The universe doesn't send pleasant messages when uncomfortable ones are needed for growth. Consider the darkest periods of your life, the times of greatest suffering, greatest confusion, greatest loss. Weren't these also the times of most profound transformation? Didn't you emerge from these crucibles changed in essential ways? This is the paradox at the heart of Jung's psychology. What seems most destructive often contains the seeds of creation. What feels like an ending often prepares the way for a beginning. What appears as a message of loss might actually be an invitation to find something more authentic than what was lost. The universe speaks in this language of paradox and symbol because some truths can't be communicated directly. They must be experienced, felt, lived into. The rational mind wants clear answers, definitive solutions, straight paths. But the psyche doesn't develop in straight lines. It spirals, circles back, revisits old territory with new awareness. Each time you encounter a familiar pattern with greater consciousness, you're hearing the message more clearly. You're receiving the communication with less distortion. You're participating more fully in your own becoming. But this requires presence, a quality increasingly rare in modern life. To receive the universe's messages, you must be present enough to notice them, attentive enough to consider their meaning, humble enough to recognize when they contradict your conscious assumptions. Jung observed that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. The distractions available today would have astonished even him. Never has it been so easy to avoid self-awareness, to numb uncomfortable emotions, to fill every moment with noise that drowns out the subtle communications of the unconscious mind. This avoidance isn't neutral. It comes at a terrible cost. The loss of meaning, because meaning emerges from relationship, from the dialogue between conscious and unconscious, between the individual and the collective, between the human and the universal. When you ignore the messages, you don't just miss information, you miss meaning itself. Jung understood that people cannot stand too much reality. The full truth of our existence, with all its complexity, mortality, and mystery, can be overwhelming. So we construct buffers, build defenses, create simplifications that make life manageable but incomplete. These psychological defenses aren't enemies to be destroyed. They served important purposes, especially in childhood when you lack the resources to process certain experiences directly. But in adulthood, these same defenses can become barriers to growth, filters that block the universe's messages. The rigid perfectionist who never feels good enough. Their perfectionism was likely once protection against criticism or rejection. The people pleaser who can't say no. Their accommodation was probably once a strategy for securing love in an environment where authentic self-expression felt unsafe. What if these patterns aren't character flaws, but adaptive strategies that have outlived their usefulness? What if they're not who you are, but what you learned to do in order to survive? The universe sends messages that challenge these outdated adaptations, situations that trigger your defenses so you can see them operating, relationships that activate your old wounds so you can finally heal them, dreams that bypass your conscious resistance to show you what you need to see. These messages often arrive disguised as problems, as Jung noted when he said, "The psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate." This is key. What you don't face internally will confront you externally. The aspects of yourself that you deny will appear in your life as seemingly external challenges. The emotions you refuse to feel will manifest as situations that force those very feelings. The truths you avoid will materialize as circumstances that make those truths unavoidable. This isn't punishment, it's integration seeking to happen. It's your complete self-orchestrating experiences that promote wholeness. But integration requires recognition. You must see the pattern to change it. You must acknowledge the projection to reclaim it. You must feel the emotion to transform it. The universe's messages grow more intense when ignored, like any communication that needs to be heard. What begins as a whisper becomes a shout. What starts as a subtle pattern becomes an unavoidable crisis. What initially appears as a minor irritation develops into a major disruption. Not because the universe is punishing you, but because the message is essential for your growth. Because the part of you that's seeking expression won't be silenced indefinitely. Because what's unconscious doesn't cease to exist or influence your life. It simply operates outside your awareness, often working against your conscious intentions. Jung recognized that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. This is the great revelation. What seems like external fate is often internal content seeking recognition. What appears as bad luck might be unacknowledged aspects of yourself creating situations that demand attention. What feels like being victimized by circumstances could actually be your own unconscious mind, arranging experiences that serve your deeper development. This doesn't mean you're to blame for everything that happens to you. It doesn't negate genuine victimization or random tragedy, but it does suggest that even within circumstances you didn't choose, your psyche is working to create meaning, to facilitate growth, to move toward wholeness. The universe speaks through these circumstances, not causing them all, but using them all as opportunities for communication. Nothing is wasted, nothing is without potential meaning. Even the most painful experiences carry messages if you're willing to receive them, especially the painful ones. As Jung observed, there is no coming to consciousness without pain. Why pain? Because pain breaks through defenses. It penetrates denial. It demands attention. It creates the crack where the light gets in. The greatest barrier to receiving the universe's messages isn't external noise or distraction. It's internal resistance, the deeply human tendency to avoid what's uncomfortable, to deny what's threatening to your self-concept, to reject what challenges your existing narrative. This resistance isn't a character flaw, it's a natural function of the psyche trying to maintain stability. But growth requires flexibility. Evolution demands change, and change is rarely comfortable. The universe's messages often feel threatening precisely because they contain what you need but have been avoiding. They highlight the gap between who you think you are and who you're capable of becoming. They reveal the distance between your current life and your potential fulfillment. When you feel that tension between what is and what could be, between what you know and what you sense, between what feels safe and what calls to your soul, you're receiving a message. The tension itself is communication. Jung believed that the tension of opposites is the fundamental element of all life and manifestation. This tension isn't something to escape, it's something to engage, consciously, courageously, with an open mind and willing heart. Because on the other side of that engagement lies what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's remarkable ability to create a third position that includes and transcends the apparent opposites. Not compromise, but genuine integration, not either or, but a higher synthesis. The universe's messages guide you toward this integration if you're willing to listen, to look, to feel, if you're brave enough to question your certainties, to examine your reactions, to consider that what seems most true might be most limited. This isn't about abandoning rationality, it's about expanding it. It's about recognizing that logic alone cannot grasp the full complexity of human experience, that some truths can only be approached through symbol, emotion, intuition, and lived experience. Jung understood that the rational mind is a brilliant but limited tool, necessary but insufficient for complete understanding. The messages of the universe often come through channels that reason alone cannot access: dreams, synchronicities, body sensations, emotional responses, creative inspirations, and those inexplicable knowings that arise from nowhere you can name. These messages don't replace rational analysis, they complement it. They fill in its blind spots. They connect you to dimensions of reality that logical thought cannot reach on its own. The integration of rational and non-rational knowing creates a more complete intelligence, one that can perceive patterns invisible to either mode alone, one that can navigate complexity with both precision and intuition, one that can receive the universe's messages in their fullness. But how do you recognize these messages when they appear? How do you distinguish meaningful patterns from random coincidence? How do you develop the capacity to receive communications that often arrive in languages you haven't been taught to speak? This recognition begins with attention, not the forced, straining kind, but the receptive, open awareness that Jung called active imagination. It's a way of perceiving that's simultaneously focused and expansive, directed yet receptive. The patterns are already there. The messages are already being sent. The question isn't whether the universe is speaking to you, it's whether you're positioned to listen. Jung observed that in all chaos there is a cosmos, in all disorder a secret order. The apparent randomness of life conceals patterns of profound meaning, patterns that reveal themselves only to the attentive mind, only to the person willing to look beyond surface appearances, to the deeper currents beneath. Notice what repeats in your life. The same relationship dynamics with different partners, the same conflicts with different colleagues, the same emotional reactions to different situations. These aren't separate events, they're variations on a theme. They're the same message appearing in different forms, growing louder until you finally hear it. Jung called these recurring patterns complexes, clusters of related thoughts, memories, perceptions, and emotions that gather around a core theme. These complexes act like independent entities within the psyche, attracting experiences that match their energy, creating situations that express their content. Your complexes shape what you notice, what you ignore, what you attract, and what you create. They filter your perception and influence your behavior, often without your awareness. They're like gravitational fields, pulling similar experiences into your orbit. The father complex that formed in childhood doesn't remain confined to your relationship with your father. It colors all your interactions with authority figures. It influences how you relate to your own authority. It shapes your expectations, your fears, your defenses. The abandonment complex that crystallized around an early loss doesn't affect only your romantic relationships. It touches every connection, every separation, every transition. It generates specific fears, triggers particular reactions, creates characteristic patterns of attachment and avoidance. These complexes aren't problems to eliminate. They're messages to understand. They contain essential information about your wounds, your needs, your deepest beliefs about yourself and the world. They're communications from your unconscious mind about what remains unintegrated, unhealed, unacknowledged. The universe arranges encounters that activate these complexes, not to punish you, but to show you, not to cause suffering, but to create opportunity for awareness, not to confirm your fears, but to help you transcend them. What triggers you most intensely? What causes disproportionate emotional reactions? What makes you feel suddenly like a child again, overwhelmed by feelings that seem too big to manage? These aren't failures of maturity. They're activations of complexes. They're messages trying to reach consciousness. Jung understood that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. This irritation isn't random. It's targeted, precise. The very qualities that provoke your strongest reactions are signposts pointing toward your unintegrated aspects, your denied needs, your rejected parts. This is projection in action, the psychological mechanism by which you attribute to others the very qualities, emotions, or intentions that you've disowned in yourself. Not because you're dishonest or manipulative, but because the psyche cannot tolerate contradictions to its conscious identity. What doesn't fit your self-image gets projected outward, where it appears as qualities of the other rather than unrecognized aspects of yourself. The judgmental person who seems to criticize your every move. They may be reflecting your own inner critic, that of judgment you've internalized but failed to recognize as distinct from your authentic self. The person whose neediness repels you, they might be expressing the very vulnerability you've learned to suppress in yourself. The individual whose anger frightens you, perhaps they're exhibiting the healthy assertion you've been taught to consider dangerous or unacceptable. These projections aren't failures, they're communications. They show you what aspects of yourself remain unconscious, what parts of your humanity you've disowned, what elements of your full spectrum you've deemed unacceptable. The universe arranges these projections with extraordinary precision, bringing you face to face with exactly what you need to see, recognize, and reintegrate. The people who trigger you most powerfully are often your greatest teachers, mirrors reflecting the very parts of yourself that you've been unable or unwilling to acknowledge. This isn't blame, it's not saying you're responsible for others' behavior or that their actions are somehow your fault. It's recognizing that your reaction contains valuable information about your own psyche. It's understanding that what affects you most strongly is speaking to something within you that needs attention. Jung noted that everything that is unconscious in ourselves we discover in our neighbor, and we treat him accordingly. This creates a world of distorted perceptions, where we respond not to others as they actually are, but to our own projections mapped onto them. Imagine the liberation that comes with withdrawing these projections, with recognizing that what you've perceived as external may actually be internal. Imagine the freedom of reclaiming the energy that's been trapped in projection, the power that's been lost in unconscious reactions, the authenticity that's been sacrificed to denial. This withdrawal of projections doesn't happen all at once. It's a process, a practice, a gradual reclaiming of disowned aspects. It requires the courage to ask uncomfortable questions. What am I not seeing in myself? What am I attributing to others that might belong to me? What would change if I owned this quality or emotion instead of locating it outside myself? The answer often feels threatening to your identity. It challenges who you think you are. It contradicts the story you've been telling yourself. That's how you know you're approaching something significant, something with the power to transform your understanding of yourself and your relationship with the world. But the universe doesn't communicate only through projection. It speaks through synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that defy causal explanation. The book that falls open to exactly the passage you needed to read, the chance encounter with someone who holds a piece of information crucial to your next step, the recurrence of a specific symbol during a time of important decision-making. Jung defined synchronicity as a causal connecting principle, a link between events based not on cause and effect, but on shared meaning. These events aren't causally related, but they're meaningfully connected. They form patterns that speak to your specific situation, your particular questions, your unique path of development. Synchronicities tend to cluster around psychologically significant moments, times of transition, decision, or internal conflict. They appear at crossroads, offering guidance that rational analysis alone cannot provide. They create bridges between your inner questions and outer events, between your unconscious needs and conscious awareness. These aren't random curiosities or supernatural interventions. They're expressions of what Jung called unus mundus, the unitary world where psyche and matter are different aspects of the same underlying reality. They're manifestations of the connection between your inner psychological state and the outer physical world. The universe speaks through these meaningful coincidences, offering confirmation, direction, warning, or insight, if you're attentive enough to notice, curious enough to consider their meaning, humble enough to receive their guidance. But synchronicities aren't the only symbolic communications from the unconscious. Dreams speak in a similar language, the language of image, symbol, emotion, and association. They bypass your conscious defenses to deliver messages from depths your waking mind cannot easily access. Jung considered dreams the royal road to the unconscious, not random neural firings or meaningless mental debris, but purposeful communications from the psyche. They don't disguise truth, they express it in the only way possible through symbol, metaphor, and narrative. The recurring dream that haunts you, the one about being unprepared, being chased, losing something valuable, finding unexpected rooms in a familiar house, isn't just a curiosity. It's a message about your psychological state, your unacknowledged fears, your unrealized potential, your unexplored depths. Dreams speak in paradoxes and contradictions because they emerge from a part of the psyche that isn't bound by the either-or logic of conscious thought. They present images that can hold multiple, even contradictory meanings simultaneously. They tell stories that unfold according to emotional rather than logical connections. The language of dreams isn't arbitrary or random. It's profoundly meaningful, precisely tailored to your individual psyche, your personal associations, your unique history. But it requires interpretation, not through rigid formulas or universal dictionaries of symbols, but through careful attention to your specific associations, reactions, and the emotional tone of the dream itself. Jung believed that dreams are impartial, spontaneous products of the unconscious psyche, outside the control of the will. They are pure nature. They show us the unvarnished natural truth, and are therefore fitted, as nothing else is, to give us back an attitude that accords with our basic human nature when our consciousness has strayed too far from its foundations and run into an impasse. They compensate for one-sided conscious attitudes. They present what's been excluded from awareness. They offer perspectives your waking mind has overlooked or rejected. They reveal what you know but don't know that you know. The universe speaks through these nighttime narratives, sending communications directly from the unconscious to the threshold of consciousness. The message may be cryptic, symbolic, seemingly nonsensical, but it's precisely calibrated to your needs, your questions, your stage of development. Beyond dreams and synchronicities, the unconscious also communicates through what Jung called active imagination, a waking engagement with unconscious content through focused attention, open receptivity, and symbolic dialogue. It's a practice of entering consciously into conversation with aspects of the psyche that normally remain beyond awareness. This isn't daydreaming or unconstrained fantasy. It's a disciplined approach to accessing unconscious wisdom, a deliberate engagement with the symbols, images, and figures that emerge from the depths when they're given space and attention. It's a way of recognizing and responding to the universe's messages as they arise from within.
Through active imagination, you might engage with dream figures, personify emotions, dialogue with archetypal energies, or explore symbolic scenarios. You allow unconscious content to express itself in consciousness, not by imposing your will upon it, but by entering into relationship with it. This practice requires courage, the courage to encounter what you've avoided, to hear what you've silenced, to see what you've denied. It demands humility.
The recognition that your conscious perspective is limited, that wisdom exists beyond the boundaries of your current understanding. And it calls for discernment, the ability to distinguish authentic communications from mere fantasy or self-deception. But the rewards are profound. Through active imagination, you gain access to the vast resources of the unconscious, not just information, but transformation, not just answers, but evolution, not just guidance, but growth. The universe speaks through these symbolic engagements, offering messages that can't be received through logical analysis alone. It communicates in a language that predates words, that transcends cultural barriers, that connects directly to the foundations of human experience. This is the language of archetypes, those universal patterns and figures that Jung identified as common to all humanity, transcending time, culture, and individual experience. The mother, the father, the hero, the shadow, the wise old man or woman, the trickster, the child. These aren't just literary motifs or psychological constructs. They're living energies within the psyche, autonomous forces that shape your perceptions, reactions, and experiences. Archetypes aren't concepts you think about, they're energies you experience. They're not abstract ideas, they're psychological realities that influence your life, whether you recognize them or not. They're the underlying patterns that give shape to your most significant experiences, your deepest emotions, your most powerful relationships. When an archetype is activated in your life, the universe sends messages related to its energy, situations that evoke its qualities, people who embody its characteristics, dreams that feature its symbols, emotions that reflect its nature. These aren't coincidences. They're communications about the archetypal process unfolding in your psychological development. The hero's journey isn't just a narrative structure, it's a psychological reality that manifests when you're called to face challenges, overcome obstacles, and discover capacities you didn't know you possessed. The death and rebirth archetype isn't just a mythological motif, it's a lived experience when an aspect of your identity must die for something new to emerge. These archetypal patterns aren't imposed from outside, they're activated from within, in response to your psychological needs, your developmental stage, your soul's evolution. They create the underlying structure of your life's most meaningful chapters, your most transformative experiences, your most significant relationships. The universe arranges situations that activate these archetypal energies, not randomly, but purposefully. Not to conform to some predetermined script, but to facilitate your unique psychological development. Not to replace your individual experience, but to give it deeper meaning and connection to the collective human journey. When you recognize these archetypal patterns, you gain perspective on your experience. You see that your struggles, while uniquely yours, also participate in universal human themes. You understand that your journey, though individual in its details, follows pathways trodden by countless others throughout human history. You realize that your story, personal as it is, also belongs to the greater human story. This recognition doesn't diminish your individual experience, it enriches it with meaning, purpose, and context. It doesn't reduce your unique suffering to a generic category, it connects that suffering to timeless human truths. It doesn't negate your personal choices, it illuminates the archetypal energies influencing those choices. Jung observed that archetypes are like riverbeds which dry up when the water deserts them, but which it can find again at any time. An archetype is like an old watercourse along which the water of life has flowed for centuries, digging a deep channel for itself. Your life flows along these channels, not because you're predetermined or lacking free will, but because these archetypal patterns are the natural pathways of human psychological development. They're the underlying structures through which the psyche organizes experience, creates meaning, and facilitates growth. The universe speaks through these archetypal patterns, sending messages about the psychological processes unfolding in your life. It communicates through the synchronicities, dreams, emotions and situations that cluster around activated archetypes, all pointing toward the specific aspect of your development that's currently seeking integration. This integration doesn't happen automatically. It requires conscious participation, the willingness to recognize these patterns, to engage with their energy, to allow their transformation within you. It demands both surrender to the process and active collaboration with it. Both acceptance of what is emerging and intentional engagement with its unfolding. Jung called this conscious collaboration with the archetypal process individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, of integrating all the fragmented aspects of yourself into a whole, authentic being. It's not about achieving some idealized state of perfection. It's about embracing the full spectrum of your humanity, incorporating both light and shadow, strength and vulnerability, masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious. Individuation isn't a straight path. It spirals, doubles back, revisits familiar territory with new awareness. It moves through cycles of death and rebirth, loss and discovery, disintegration and reintegration. It follows the archetypal pattern of the hero's journey, with its calls to adventure, its thresholds to cross, its trials to endure, its mentors to meet, its gifts to bring back. The universe orchestrates this journey, arranging the exact experiences, relationships, challenges, and revelations you need for your particular path of development. It sends messages through synchronicities that guide your way, dreams that illuminate your blind spots, emotions that signal your needs, projections that reveal your unconscious content. These messages aren't arbitrary or random. They're precisely tailored to your psychological state, your developmental needs, your soul's evolution. They're communications from the totality of your psyche, what Jung called the self with a capital S, to your limited conscious mind. The self knows what you need before you know it. It arranges encounters with the exact archetypal energies required for your growth. It orchestrates situations that activate the specific complexes you need to become conscious of. It creates circumstances that challenge the very aspects of your identity that must transform for your evolution to continue. This orchestration isn't punishment or reward. It's not karma or fate. It's the psyche's inherent movement toward wholeness. A movement that's supported by the fundamental structure of reality itself. It's the universe speaking to you through the language of experience, the grammar of emotion, the vocabulary of symbol. But how do you learn to recognize these patterns? How do you develop the capacity to receive these messages? How do you distinguish meaningful communications from random noise? It begins with attention, not forced concentration but receptive awareness. It requires presence in your own experience, the willingness to notice what's happening within and around you, without immediately jumping to explanation, judgment, or reaction. It demands curiosity about the patterns in your life, the recurring themes, the situations that evoke strong emotional responses. Notice what repeats, the relationship dynamics that play out with different partners, the conflicts that emerge in different contexts, the emotions that arise in seemingly unrelated situations. These repetitions aren't coincidences. They're communications about unconscious patterns seeking integration. Pay attention to what triggers you, the people who irritate you inexplicably, the situations that provoke reactions that seem disproportionate, the comments that touch unexpected nerves. These triggers aren't random sensitivity. They're precise activations of unconscious complexes. They're messages about what needs recognition and healing. Observe what you dream, the recurring scenarios, the emotion that lingers after waking, the symbols that appear during significant life transitions.
These aren't random neural activity. They're communications from parts of your psyche that can't speak directly to consciousness. They're messages encoded in the language of symbol and emotion.
Notice the synchronicities that appear in your life, the coincidences that seem meaningful, the patterns that can't be explained by cause and effect alone, the events that feel charged with significance beyond their surface appearance. These aren't statistical anomalies, they're manifestations of what Jung called the causal connecting principle. They're messages written in the language of meaningful coincidence. This attentiveness isn't about forcing interpretations or jumping to conclusions. It's about creating space for meaning to emerge. It's about holding questions rather than rushing to answers. It's about developing the capacity to perceive patterns without imposing them. Jung emphasized that the foundation of all mental illness is the unwillingness to experience legitimate suffering. This doesn't mean seeking suffering or glorifying pain. It means being willing to feel what is true, to face what is real, to encounter what is present, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it challenges your identity, even when it contradicts your conscious beliefs about yourself or the world. This willingness opens the channels of communication. It creates receptivity to the universe's messages. It allows the unconscious to speak to consciousness without being immediately silenced, dismissed, or rationalized away. The messages are already being sent. The patterns are already present. The communications are already occurring. The question isn't whether the universe is speaking to you, it's whether you're positioned to listen. This listening isn't passive. It's an active engagement with your own experience, a curious exploration of its meaning, a courageous inquiry into its patterns. It requires both intuition and discernment, both openness and critical thinking, both emotional sensitivity and intellectual clarity. Jung believed that everything depends on how we look at things and not on how they are in themselves. This isn't relativism or subjectivism. It's recognition of the creative role consciousness plays in the perception of meaning. It's acknowledgement that messages must be received, not just sent, interpreted, not just delivered. The universe speaks in a language of potentiality. It offers symbolic communications that can be read in multiple ways, that contain various levels of meaning, that invite creative interpretation rather than dogmatic certainty. It sends messages that don't dictate specific actions, but illuminate the psychological dynamics at play in your life, the unconscious patterns, the activated archetypes, the complexes seeking integration. These illuminations don't tell you what to do, they show you what is. They reveal the psychological reality that's shaping your experience, the projections distorting your perceptions, the complexes influencing your reactions, the archetypal energies structuring your journey. With this awareness comes choice, not unlimited freedom from all psychological influence, but the expanded agency that comes with greater consciousness, not escape from the archetypal patterns that structure human experience, but more intentional participation in their unfolding. Not immunity to unconscious influences, but reduced blindness to their operation. Jung observed that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. This is the fundamental shift that comes with recognizing the universe's messages, from experiencing life as something that happens to you, to understanding it as something that happens through you and for you. From seeing external events as random or arbitrary, to perceiving the meaningful patterns that connect them to your psychological development. This shift doesn't mean taking responsibility for everything that happens to you. It doesn't negate genuine victimization or random tragedy. It doesn't deny the reality of external circumstances beyond your control, but it does transform your relationship with those circumstances from helpless reaction to meaningful response, from unconscious repetition to conscious engagement, from blind submission to creative participation. The universe speaks to guide this transformation, not to predict the future or prescribe specific paths, but to illuminate the psychological realities shaping your present. Not to replace your choices with predetermined outcomes, but to expand the consciousness with which you make those choices. Not to remove life's challenges, but to reveal their potential meaning and purpose in your development. These messages aren't meant to be followed blindly or interpreted literally. They're invitations to deeper awareness, to expanded perspective, to more complete self-knowledge. They're communications from the totality of your psyche to the limited part that identifies as I, not to control that I, but to enrich it with wisdom from beyond its boundaries. Jung understood that who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes. The universe's messages guide this awakening from the dream of a life determined by external forces to the reality of a life influenced by unconscious factors brought gradually into awareness. From the illusion of a separate self isolated from the world to the truth of a psyche intimately connected with all that is. This awakening isn't a destination but a process, ongoing, unfolding, evolving. It doesn't eliminate the unconscious or render all its contents conscious. It doesn't remove all projection or dissolve all complexes. It doesn't complete individuation or fulfill the self's potential once and for all. But it does transform your relationship with the unconscious, from adversary to ally, from threat to resource, from alien force to essential aspect of your complete being. It changes your experience of the universe's messages from cryptic communications to meaningful guidance, from random coincidences to purposeful patterns, from confusing signals to clarifying insights. The universe speaks not to control your path, but to illuminate it. Not to eliminate your agency, but to enhance it through greater awareness. Not to replace your individuality with conformity to external demands, but to deepen your authenticity through integration of all you truly are. Jung believed that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. The universe's messages guide this becoming, not by providing a map to follow, but by illuminating the territory you're traversing. Not by telling you who you should be, but by revealing who you already are beneath the layers of conditioning, adaptation, and unconscious identification. Not by imposing external standards of development, but by facilitating the unfolding of your unique psychological pattern. These messages speak to your particular journey, your specific challenges, your individual path of growth. They're not generic platitudes or universal prescriptions. They're communications precisely calibrated to your psychological state, your developmental needs, your soul's evolution. The archetypes activated in your life, the complexes triggered by your experiences, the synchronicities appearing in your path, the dreams emerging from your unconscious. These are all aspects of a coordinated communication from the totality of your psyche to your conscious mind. They're messages tailored to your unique situation, your personal questions, your individual development. Recognizing these patterns doesn't mean interpreting every event as personally meaningful or seeing signs in every coincidence. It doesn't mean abandoning discernment or critical thinking. It doesn't mean projecting meaning onto random occurrences or finding patterns where none exist. It means developing the capacity to perceive meaningful connections without forcing them, to recognize significant patterns without fabricating them, to receive authentic communications from the unconscious without confusing them with conscious fantasies or wishful thinking. This discernment requires both intuition and reason, both emotional sensitivity and intellectual clarity,
both openness to meaning and critical evaluation of interpretation. It demands the integration of multiple ways of knowing, the very integration that Jung saw as essential to psychological health and development. The universe speaks in all these languages: reason and intuition, thought and feeling, sensation and intuition. It sends messages through all these channels: logical connections and meaningful coincidences, causal relationships and symbolic resonances, material realities and psychological truths. To receive these messages in their fullness, you must develop fluency in multiple languages, receptivity through multiple channels, understanding through multiple languages, receptivity through multiple channels, understanding through multiple modes of knowing. You must cultivate what Jung called psychological types, the various ways that consciousness orients to experience, the different functions through which the psyche perceives and processes reality. This integration doesn't privilege one mode over others. It doesn't elevate intuition above reason or feeling above thinking. It recognizes the value of each function, the limitations of each perspective, the contributions of each approach to a more complete understanding.
The universe's messages include both causal connections that satisfy the rational mind and meaningful coincidences that speak to intuitive knowing, both logical progressions that appeal to thinking and value-laden experiences that resonate with feeling, both sensory realities that ground in the material world and symbolic communications that connect to the collective unconscious. What happens when you begin to integrate these messages? When you recognize the patterns, withdraw the projections, acknowledge the complexes, engage with the archetypes. What transformation becomes possible when you start to consciously participate in the dialogue between your conscious and unconscious mind? This is where Jung's concept of individuation becomes lived experience rather than abstract theory. Individuation isn't self-improvement in the conventional sense. It's not about becoming a better version of yourself according to external standards or cultural ideals. It's about becoming more fully yourself, integrating the fragments, embracing the contradictions, acknowledging the wholeness that includes both light and shadow. Jung defined individuation as the process by which individual beings are formed and differentiated. In particular, it is the development of the psychological individual as a being distinct from the general collective psychology. It's a journey towards psychological uniqueness, not by rejecting the collective, but by consciously assimilating collective elements rather than being unconsciously determined by them. This journey doesn't separate you from humanity. It connects you more authentically. It doesn't isolate you in individuality. It grounds you in what Jung called the 2-million-year-old man that is in all of us. It doesn't reject the archetypal patterns that structure human experience. It engages with them consciously rather than being blindly driven by them. The integrated person isn't free from archetypal influences or unconscious factors. They're aware of these influences in relationship with these factors, conscious of what was previously unconscious. They don't escape the human condition. They embrace it with greater awareness, intention, and authenticity. This integration begins with the shadow, those aspects of yourself that you've rejected, denied, or disowned, the qualities you've deemed unacceptable, the emotions you've learned to suppress, the needs you've been taught to ignore, the parts of your humanity that didn't fit your self-image or weren't permitted by your family, culture, or society. Jung observed that the shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, for no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. To become conscious of it involves recognizing the dark aspects of the personality as present and real. This recognition isn't comfortable. It challenges your self-concept. It contradicts the story you've been telling about who you are. It reveals aspects of yourself that you've worked hard to deny, control, or eliminate. But these aspects don't disappear when rejected. They go underground. They operate from the shadows, influencing your perceptions, triggering your reactions, shaping your experiences, often in ways contrary to your conscious intentions. Shadow integration doesn't mean acting out every impulse or indulging every desire. It means acknowledging these impulses and desires as parts of your psychological reality. It means recognizing that what you've rejected doesn't cease to exist. It simply exists beyond your awareness, beyond your control. The shadow contains not only your negative qualities, your aggression, selfishness, laziness, greed, but also positive attributes that didn't fit your self-concept or weren't valued in your environment. Creativity in a family that prized practicality, sensitivity in a culture that rewarded toughness, independence in a system that demanded conformity. Integrating the shadow means reclaiming these disowned parts, both negative and positive. It means expanding your sense of self to include what you've previously rejected. It means developing relationship with aspects of your psyche that you've treated as not me. This integration doesn't happen through intellectual understanding alone. It requires emotional engagement, experiential recognition, lived acknowledgement. It demands the willingness to feel what you've avoided feeling, to know what you've resisted knowing, to be what you've refused to be. The universe arranges situations that facilitate this integration, bringing you face to face with your projections, activating your complexes, triggering your shadow material, not to punish you but to show you what remains unconscious, not to cause suffering, but to create opportunity for awareness, not to confirm your fears, but to help you transcend them through recognition and integration. When you begin to withdraw projections to recognize that what you've perceived as qualities of others may actually be disowned aspects of yourself, you reclaim energy that's been trapped in unconscious processes. You recover parts of your authentic being that have been lost to projection. You expand your sense of self to include more of your complete humanity. This doesn't mean taking responsibility for others' behavior or denying genuine differences between yourself and them. It means recognizing that your perception of others is filtered through your psychological reality, colored by your projections, shaped by your unconscious expectations. It means understanding that your strongest reactions often reveal more about you than about the person triggering them. Jung noted that projection is one of the commonest psychic phenomena. Everything that is unconscious in ourselves we discover in our neighbor, and we treat him accordingly. This projection creates a world of distorted perceptions, where we respond not to others as they actually are, but to our own projections mapped onto them. The withdrawal of projections doesn't eliminate these distortions entirely. That would require complete consciousness, which Jung considered an unattainable ideal. But it does reduce their intensity, their automaticity, their power to control your perceptions and reactions. It creates space between stimulus and response, space for conscious choice, for intentional engagement, for authentic relationship. This space doesn't appear all at once. It opens gradually, inconsistently, partially, expanding in some areas while remaining closed in others, accessible in certain relationships while still constricted in others, available in some emotional states while vanishing in others. It's not a permanent achievement, but a continual practice, not a destination but a direction, not a state to reach, but a process to engage. The integration of projection is just one aspect of the larger process. Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to create a third position that includes and transcends apparent opposites. Not compromise, but genuine integration. Not either or, but a higher synthesis that contains elements of both while being reducible to neither. This transcendent function operates in the integration of all psychological opposites, conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine, light and shadow, thinking
and feeling, individual and collective. It doesn't eliminate these polarities, it creates relationship between them. It doesn't dissolve differences, it establishes dialogue across differences. It doesn't reduce complexity, it embraces complexity with expanded consciousness. Jung believed that the confrontation of the two positions generates a tension charged with energy and creates a living. Third thing, a movement out of the suspension between opposites, a living birth that leads to a new level of being, a new situation. This new level of being doesn't resolve all tensions or eliminate all conflicts. It doesn't perfect the personality or complete the individuation process once and for all.
But it does create greater wholeness, authenticity, and integration. It expands consciousness to include more of the psyche's totality. It establishes relationship between aspects of the self that were previously disconnected, conflicted, or alienated from each other. The universe orchestrates situations that facilitate this integration, not by arranging external circumstances according to some predetermined plan, but by manifesting the psyche's inherent movement toward wholeness in the material world. Not by controlling events to serve some cosmic agenda, but by expressing psychological realities in physical form. Not by imposing meaning from outside, but by manifesting the meaning inherent in the psyche's development. Jung observed that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. What you don't face internally confronts you externally. What you don't integrate psychologically manifests physically. What you don't acknowledge consciously appears unconsciously in your circumstances, relationships, and experiences. This manifestation isn't punishment or reward, it's communication. It's the psyche's attempt to bring unconscious content into awareness, to facilitate integration, to move toward wholeness. It's the universe speaking to you through the language of experience, arranging precisely the encounters, relationships, challenges, and opportunities you need for your psychological development. When you begin to recognize these communications, to receive these messages, to engage with this dialogue between conscious and unconscious, transformation becomes possible, not the superficial change that comes from modifying behavior without addressing its roots, but the profound transformation that emerges from genuine psychological integration. This transformation doesn't happen all at once. It unfolds gradually, cyclically, through stages of death and rebirth, loss and discovery, disintegration and reintegration. It follows archetypal patterns of transformation that have structured human experience throughout history, patterns reflected in myths, religious symbols, alchemical processes, and initiation rituals across cultures. Jung studied these patterns extensively, particularly in alchemy, which he understood not merely as a primitive attempt at chemistry, but as a symbolic system expressing the process of psychological transformation. The alchemical stages of nigredo, blackening, albedo, whitening, citronitas, yellowing, and rubdo, reddening, correspond to psychological phases of confrontation with the shadow, recognition of projections, integration of opposites, and emergence of the authentic self. These aren't linear stages to progress through once and complete forever. They're cyclical phases that recur throughout life at increasingly complex levels. They're aspects of an ongoing process of psychological development that continues as long as consciousness exists. They're elements of a journey that doesn't end with any final achievement, but unfolds through ever-deepening spirals of awareness and integration. The universe speaks through these transformative processes, sending messages that guide each phase, facilitate each transition, support each integration. It communicates through the psychological experiences that accompany these phases, the depression that often signals the nigredo, the illumination characteristic of the albedo, the new values emerging in the citronitas, the grounded wisdom of the rubedo. These experiences aren't random emotional states or meaningless fluctuations of mood. They're communications about your psychological process, messages about the transformation unfolding within you, guidance for navigating the current phase of your development. Jung believed that there is no coming to consciousness without pain. This pain isn't punishment for past actions or arbitrary suffering without purpose. It's an essential aspect of genuine transformation, the discomfort that accompanies the dissolution of old patterns, the disorientation that arises when familiar structures break down, the vulnerability that emerges when defensive mechanisms relax. This pain serves a purpose, not to cause suffering but to facilitate growth, not to punish but to transform, not to damage but to heal at a deeper level than was possible before the breakdown. It's the pain of the chrysalis dissolving before the butterfly emerges, of the seed's shell cracking before the plant can grow, of the old identity falling away before the new can form. The universe speaks through this pain, sending messages about what's dissolving, what's emerging, what's trying to come into being through you. It communicates through the specific quality of your suffering, the particular challenges you face, the precise fears that arise, the exact areas of life that seem to be falling apart. These aren't random difficulties or generic hardships. They're communications precisely tailored to your psychological state, your developmental needs, your soul's evolution. They're messages about what aspects of yourself are ready for integration, what patterns are prepared for transformation, what capacities are primed for emergence. Jung noted that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. This acceptance isn't passive resignation to unchangeable flaws or complacent tolerance of harmful patterns. It's active engagement with the truth of who you are, the full spectrum of your humanity, the complete range of your capacities, the total extent of your being beyond the limited identity you've constructed. This acceptance creates the conditions for genuine transformation, not by forcing change from a place of self-rejection, but by allowing evolution from a foundation of self-acknowledgement, not by fighting against what is, but by working with it, not by denying your current reality, but by embracing it as the necessary starting point for any authentic development. The universe supports this acceptance by arranging situations that make denial increasingly difficult, projection increasingly obvious, unconscious patterns increasingly apparent, not to expose your flaws or highlight your failures, but to invite more complete self-recognition, not to shame you for what you've been, but to call you toward what you're capable of becoming, not to define you by your past, but to liberate you for your future. This liberation doesn't come from escaping your humanity, transcending your psychology, or achieving some perfect state beyond all limitation. It emerges from embracing your humanity more completely, engaging with your psychology more consciously, accepting the imperfection inherent in being human, while continuously evolving toward greater wholeness. Jung understood that the achievement of personality is the successful adaptation to the universal facts of human existence, coupled with the greatest possible freedom for self-determination. This isn't freedom from all influence, but freedom within influence, not independence from all conditioning, but conscious relationship with conditioning, not escape from all limitation, but creative engagement with limitation. The universe speaks to guide this engagement, not by removing obstacles or eliminating challenges, but by arranging precisely the challenges you need for your development. Not by making your path easy, but by making it meaningful. Not by shielding you from difficulty, but by sending messages that help you perceive the purpose within difficulty. These messages often come through crisis, those times when familiar patterns no longer work, when old identities no longer fit,
when previous strategies no longer succeed. These aren't failures or punishments, they're communications about the necessity for growth, the readiness for transformation, the ripeness for evolution. Jung observed that the decisive question for man is he related to something infinite or not? That is the telling question of his life. This relationship with the infinite isn't an abstract theological concept or metaphysical speculation. It's lived experience of connection with something beyond the boundaries of the constructed self, beyond the limitations of the ego, beyond the confines of what you've known yourself to be. This connection doesn't require adherence to any particular religious tradition or spiritual framework. It can be experienced through relationship with nature, engagement with art, immersion in creative flow, encounter with archetypal energies, participation in collective rituals, connection with other beings, or direct perception of the numinous quality of existence itself. The universe speaks through these experiences of transcendence, not to direct you toward any specific path or practice, but to remind you of dimensions beyond the material, perspectives beyond the rational, realities beyond the visible. Not to demand belief in any particular concept of the divine, but to invite recognition of the sacred dimension inherent in existence. Not to impose any single understanding of ultimate reality, but to facilitate your unique relationship with the mystery that encompasses all understanding. This relationship transforms how you receive the universe's messages, not as communications from an external source to your separate self, but as dialogue within the unity that includes both universe and self. Not as information transmitted from somewhere else to where you are, but as wisdom emerging from the interconnected field that you participate in. Not as guidance from outside to inside, but as communication within the whole that contains both outside and inside. Jung believed that the decisive question for man is he related to something infinite or not? That is the telling question of his life. This relationship with the infinite isn't an abstract theological concept or metaphysical speculation. It's lived experience of connection with something beyond the boundaries of the constructed self, beyond the limitations of the ego, beyond the confines of what you've known yourself to be. This connection doesn't require adherence to any particular religious tradition or spiritual framework. It can be experienced through relationship with nature, engagement with art, immersion in creative flow, encounter with archetypal energies, participation in collective rituals, connection with other beings, or direct perception of the numinous quality of existence itself. The universe speaks through these experiences, trenches of transcendence, not to direct you toward any specific path or practice, but to remind you of dimensions beyond the material, perspectives beyond the rationals, beyond the material, perspectives beyond the rational, realities beyond the visible. Not to demand belief in any particular concept of divine, but to invite recognition of our unsynchronous dimension, invite recognition, influence dimension, influence dimension, influence dimension,
This relationship transforms how you receive the universe's messages, not as communications from an external source to your separate self, but as dialogue within the unity that includes both universe and self. Not as information transmitted from somewhere else to where you are, but as wisdom emerging from the interconnected field that you participate in. Not as guidance from outside to inside, but as communication within the whole that contains both outside and inside. Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. This becoming isn't about achieving some predetermined identity or fulfilling some external standard of success. It's about allowing the authentic self to emerge through the integration of conscious and unconscious, the withdrawal of projections, the acceptance of shadow, the engagement with archetypes, the relationship with the infinite. This authentic self isn't static or fixed. It's dynamic, evolving, continuously becoming. It's not a final achievement, but an ongoing process, not a destination, but a journey, not a state to reach, but a way of being to embody. It's what Jung called the self, not the ego that identifies as I, but the totality of the psyche that includes both conscious and unconscious dimensions. The universe speaks to guide this journey of becoming, not by telling you who you should be, but by showing you who you already are, beneath the layers of conditioning, adaptation, and unconscious identification. Not by imposing external standards of development, but by facilitating the unfolding of your unique psychological pattern. Not by directing you towards some generic ideal of perfection, but by supporting the manifestation of your singular authenticity. These communications aren't commands to obey or instructions to follow. They're invitations to greater awareness, opportunities for expanded consciousness, openings to more complete integration. They don't demand specific actions or prescribe particular paths. They illuminate the psychological dynamics at play in your life, reveal the unconscious patterns shaping your experience, clarify the archetypal energies influencing your journey. With this illumination comes choice, not unlimited freedom from all psychological influence, but expanded agency through greater consciousness. Not escape from the archetypal patterns that structure human experience, but more intentional participation in their unfolding. Not immunity to unconscious factors, but reduced blindness to their operation. Jung observed that freedom of will is the ability to do gladly that which I must do. This isn't the illusory freedom of an isolated ego, acting independently of all influence. It's the authentic freedom that comes from conscious alignment with the deeper currents of your being, from intentional participation in your own becoming, from willing engagement with the process of individuation. This freedom doesn't eliminate challenges or remove obstacles. It transforms your relationship with challenges, your engagement with obstacles. It doesn't change the fact of limitation, but it alters how you experience limitation, from external constraint to be resisted, to creative boundary that focuses energy and direction. The universe speaks to support this transformation, not by removing difficulties, but by revealing their potential meaning and purpose. Not by making your path easy, but by making it meaningful. Not by shielding you from suffering, but by illuminating how specific forms of suffering might serve your development. This illumination doesn't justify needless suffering or rationalize preventable pain. It doesn't demand passive acceptance of injustice or resignation to unnecessary hardship, but it does invite deeper questioning of the meaning within unavoidable difficulty, the purpose behind inevitable challenge, the potential growth contained in necessary pain. Jung believed that the sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light in the darkness of mere being. This light isn't the elimination of darkness, but the consciousness that can perceive meaning within it. It's not the absence of shadow, but the awareness that can integrate shadow into a more complete self. It's not perpetual happiness, but the capacity to find purpose in the full spectrum of human experience, joy and sorrow, success and failure, connection and loneliness, certainty and doubt. The universe speaks to kindle this light, not by providing answers that eliminate questions, but by offering communications that deepen inquiry. Not by resolving mysteries, but by inviting engagement with mystery. Not by removing uncertainty, but by revealing the creative potential within uncertainty. These communications don't simplify life's complexity or reduce its ambiguity. They don't provide formulas that eliminate the need for discernment or rules that replace the responsibility of choice. They offer perspectives that expand consciousness, insights that deepen understanding, connections that increase meaning. Jung wrote that as far as we can discern, the sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light in the darkness of mere being. This kindling isn't a single act, but a continuous process, not lighting a lamp once and for all, but constantly attending to the flame of consciousness in a world that would extinguish it. Not achieving enlightenment as a permanent state, but maintaining awareness as an ongoing practice. Not arriving at complete understanding, but committing to eternal learning. The universe speaks to support this practice, not by making it unnecessary, but by making it possible. Not by eliminating the darkness, but by providing just enough light to take the next step. Not by revealing the entire path, but by illuminating the ground beneath your feet. These messages aren't delivered as clear instructions or explicit directions. They arrive as synchronicities that catch your attention, dreams that stir your curiosity, emotions that signal importance, situations that invite reflection. They speak in the language of symbol and metaphor, pattern and resonance, meaningful coincidence, and symbolic connection. Learning to receive these messages requires developing new capacities, not just rational analysis, but intuitive recognition, not just logical deduction, but symbolic perception, not just intellectual understanding, but embodied knowing. It demands expanding beyond familiar modes of cognition to embrace ways of knowing that include but transcend reason. This expansion doesn't abandon critical thinking or replace discernment. It enriches thinking with feeling, balances analysis with intuition, complements reason with other forms of intelligence. It integrates multiple ways of knowing into a more complete capacity for understanding, one that can perceive both causal connections and meaningful coincidences, both logical progressions and symbolic resonances, both material realities and psychological truths. The universe speaks in all these languages: reason and intuition, thought and feeling, sensation and perception. It sends messages through all these channels: logical connections and meaningful coincidences, causal relationships and symbolic resonances, material events and psychological experiences. It communicates through both external circumstances and internal states, both collective patterns and individual variations, both universal archetypes and personal symbols. To receive these messages in their fullness requires integration of opposites within yourself, the very integration that Jung saw as essential to psychological health and development. It demands transcending false dichotomies: rational selus, irrational, objective subjective, inner outer, individual cell collective. It calls for recognition of the interconnection between apparent opposites, the relationship between seemingly separate aspects of experience. This integration doesn't happen through intellectual understanding alone. It requires lived experience, emotional engagement, embodied knowing. It demands not just comprehending Jung's concepts, but applying them to your actual life, your real relationships, your specific challenges. It calls for not just reading about individuation, but embarking on the journey yourself, with all its discomfort, uncertainty, and transformation. The universe supports this journey in ways both subtle and dramatic, through quiet moments of insight and thunderous experiences of revelation, through gentle nudges of synchronicity and powerful eruptions of archetypal energy, through whispered messages in dreams and shouted communications in crisis. These aren't separate phenomena, but aspects of a unified process, the psyche's movement toward wholeness, consciousness expanding to include more of its own totality, the self emerging through the integration of all you are. This process doesn't end with any final achievement or permanent attainment. It continues throughout life, through cycles of integration and differentiation, expansion and consolidation, death and rebirth. It unfolds not in linear progression, but in spiraling evolution,
revisiting familiar territories with new awareness, encountering old patterns with expanded consciousness, facing perennial challenges with greater integration.
The universe speaks to guide each phase of this evolution, not to eliminate struggle or remove challenge, but to illuminate meaning within struggle, purpose behind challenge. Not to provide answers that close questions, but to offer perspectives that deepen inquiry. Not to finalize understanding, but to continually expand it. Jung believed that the pendulum of the mind oscillates between sense and nonsense, not between right and wrong. This oscillation isn't failure or instability. It's the natural rhythm of consciousness, the necessary movement of the psyche, the essential dynamism of being human. It's not something to transcend or eliminate, but something to embrace and integrate, the very ground of authentic existence. The universe speaks through these oscillations, the movements between certainty and doubt, clarity and confusion, connection and alienation, meaning and meaninglessness. It sends messages not despite these fluctuations, but through them, using the full spectrum of human experience as its vocabulary, the complete range of psychological states as its grammar. Receiving these messages doesn't deliver you to some perfect state beyond all struggle or challenge. It transforms your relationship with struggle, your engagement with challenge. It doesn't provide final answers, but it enriches the questions you're living. It doesn't eliminate uncertainty, but it infuses uncertainty with meaning, purpose, and direction. This transformation isn't about becoming someone else or escaping who you are. It's about becoming more fully yourself, integrating what you've denied, withdrawing what you've projected, acknowledging what you've ignored, embracing what you've rejected. It's about expanding beyond the narrow identity you've constructed to include more of your authentic being, your complete humanity, your total existence. Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. The universe speaks to support this becoming, not by telling you who you should be, but by showing you who you already are, beneath the layers of conditioning, adaptation, and identification, not by leading you away from yourself, but by guiding you deeper into your authentic being, not by imposing external ideals, but by facilitating the emergence of your unique truth. This journey isn't about achieving perfection, but embracing wholeness, a wholeness that includes imperfection, limitation, and shadow alongside strength, capacity, and light. It's not about becoming some idealized version of yourself, but about being authentically who you are, with all your contradictions, complexities, and capacities. The universe speaks to guide this authentic being, not by providing a map to follow, but by illuminating the territory you're traversing, not by telling you who you should be, but by revealing who you already are beneath the layers of adaptation and unconscious identification, not by imposing external standards of development, but by facilitating the unfolding of your unique psychological pattern. These messages aren't commands to obey or instructions to follow. They're invitations to greater awareness, opportunities for expanded consciousness, openings to more complete integration. They don't demand specific actions or prescribe particular paths. They illuminate the psychological dynamics at play in your life, reveal the unconscious patterns shaping your experience, clarify the archetypal energies influencing your journey. With this illumination comes not just understanding, but transformation, not the superficial change that comes from modifying behavior without addressing its roots, but the profound transformation that emerges from genuine psychological integration, not temporary improvement according to external standards, but lasting evolution toward authentic being. This transformation doesn't happen all at once or once and for all. It unfolds gradually, cyclically, through ongoing interaction between conscious and unconscious, continuous dialogue between ego and self, persistent engagement with the messages the universe sends in every moment, every relationship, every challenge, every joy. The question isn't whether the universe is speaking to you, it's whether you're listening, not just with your intellect, but with your emotions, not just with your conscious mind, but with your unconscious awareness. Not just with your thinking, but with your feeling, your intuition, your embodied knowing. Are you willing to hear what's being communicated through your dreams, your synchronicities, your relationships, your challenges? Are you ready to recognize the patterns, withdraw the projections, integrate the shadow, engage with the archetypes? Are you prepared to receive the universe's messages, not as external guidance from somewhere else, but as communications from the totality of which you're already part? This reception isn't passive, it's active engagement with your own experience, curious exploration of its meaning, courageous inquiry into its patterns. It requires both intuition and discernment, both openness and critical thinking, both emotional sensitivity and intellectual clarity. The universe is always speaking. Its messages are always being sent. The patterns are already present. The communications are already occurring. The question isn't whether the universe is trying to reach you, it's whether you're positioned to listen, not just occasionally or selectively, but continuously and completely. Not just when the messages confirm what you want to hear, but when they challenge your assumptions, contradict your beliefs, or invite you beyond the boundaries of your familiar self. This listening transforms not just what you hear, but who you are, as the one who hears, expanding your consciousness, integrating your fragmented aspects, evolving your capacity to receive reality in its fullness. It changes not just your understanding of the universe's messages, but your relationship with the universe itself, from separate observer to active participant, from isolated individual to connected being, from recipient of external communications to conscious element within the communicating whole. The universe speaks not to control your path, but to illuminate it, not to eliminate your agency, but to enhance it through greater awareness, not to replace your individuality with conformity to external demands, but to deepen your authenticity through integration of all you truly are. Are you listening?